It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you all here. One remark which is totally unrelated to this. Those of you who were at the seminar on at our internal seminar on Norway, where I ended saying that last Thursday, I ended saying that it won't be long with this government that there will be other incidents. The next day they appointed a deputy minister who had said that on certain days she feels that the United Nations should send rockets against Israel. So we are in with these people for a couple of exciting years. Now to the subject of today. Before I introduce Dr. Simcha Epstein, who is a very interesting scholar on this issue, how people. He wrote a book on, which I found a very interesting book, and which he spent a lot of time in, how the people who supported Dreyfus in the Dreyfus affair, those who survived till the Nazis came, were all pro-Nazi at that time. And it was a very interesting book. It was premiated by the French Academy, and then he wrote this book, where, which you can look at later, which is called, I'll translate it, a French paradox, anti-racists in the collaboration, anti-Semites in the resistance. So these are these phenomena, and of course for us today, this whole idea is a certain president of a certain big country, is he a new Chamberlain? Are we living through a new period of appeasement? What is similar to the 1930s and what is different? Because obviously communication methods have dramatically changed. I mean, from that point of view, it's obviously not very similar. On the other hand, you see this revival of pacifists, moral relativists, appeasers, all in front of threats which they obfuscate, which of course, if you read the books about Chamberlain's England, the people who were right at that time were of course a small minority, and that gives us sometimes a lot of hope. But we see all these phenomena, and in this context, because Simcha has really been, in my mind, the one who has gone, at least in one country, even though I'll speak about a few other countries, the one who has gone deepest in this whole strange phenomenon, how people who come from one side of the spectrum suddenly move, or not suddenly, gradually move, how humanists admire Hitler. These are extremely interesting phenomena. I don't think anybody has, I've never seen at least anybody who has gone into this tremendous depths. Must have been a very unpleasant experience to walk yourself through all kinds of these figures and their unpleasant writings and sayings. I won't, I have to, Dr. Epstein teaches at the Hebrew University and has published a number of books on anti-Semitism, racism and Jewish history. One of those you can look into afterwards, those of you who know French. I won't be longer.
Boker Tov, good morning. I'm going to try with the concept of new anti-Semitism. We all know that concept, and we deal a lot of times about the concept. It's a very old concept. It appeared after the 6 Days War, and then we spoke about the new anti-Semitism after the 6 Days War. We spoke about the new anti-Semitism in the 50s, confronting the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, and we said there is a new anti-Semitism, a new kind of anti-Semitism. But the first time it appeared, so I discovered, it was in 1938. 1938, in Western Europe, for the Jewish organizations and for the organizations who were fighting anti-Semitism in various countries, in France, in Belgium, in other countries, the concept appeared in 1938. It was a way of defining those persons who before were pro-Jewish, were Philo-Semites, and who were changing their mind and their attitude concerning the Jews during the 30s. So, for Jewish organizations in the 30s, it was clear that there were two kinds of anti-Semitism. The Nazi anti-Semitism, which was dominating the scene, of course, and which was dominating, which was the dominating phenomenon of the period, and another kind of anti-Semitism coming from humanitarians, pacifists, leftists, formerly pro-Jewish, formerly opposed to racism and to anti-Semitism, and who are changing their attitude concerning the Jews. So that's a phenomenon which is interesting and important to observe in the 30s, because there is a lot of things we can learn about what is happening today. Also today, as Manfred said, the dimensions are different, the conditions are different, the circumstances are different, and so on. I made my research about France, and France is essential about the question. You need a big country. France is a country which was the only one in Europe which could match Nazi Germany, which could intervene in Nazi Germany in the 30s if they wanted to do that. So it was the country for which pacifism was critical, because pacifism prevented any French intervention in Germany as long as it was possible, till 36, 37. France is also a country which will be occupied by the Nazis. So with France we have the possibility of following the itineraries of the persons under occupation. That's the difference between France and Great Britain. Great Britain will not be occupied, so you cannot know how the British pacifists will behave during occupation, because there was no occupation. So you have some indications for some of them, but basically you have not the mass experience of occupation and of behavior under occupation. A few words, a few indicators about what is going to happen during the war, and then we'll come back to the phenomenon and to the analysis of the phenomenon. During the war, an important number of ministers of Vichy regime were former Philo-Semites. And as I established in my research, there were much more former Philo-Semites than former anti-Semites in the Vichy regime. Some of them were even very active in their Philo-Semitism. They participated, for instance, to mass rallies protesting against anti-Semitism. They wrote articles against anti-Semitism. They wrote even, one of them wrote even a book against anti-Semitism. And you find them, a few years afterwards, you find them members of the Vichy regime. I'll give just one example very, very quickly. In 1939, in the last public rally against anti-Semitism in Paris, which is organized in June 1939, you have the participation of one of the leaders of the unions, the Union of the Workers. And he has a wonderful speech saying to the Jews, "We are on your side, and we will always remain on your side till the victory of democracy and victory of freedom." 1 year afterwards, he's a member of the government, of the Pétain government, and he is one of the ministers who elaborate the laws discriminating the Jews, which will be adopted in October 1940. That's an example. There are a lot of other examples, of course, which I have no time to deal with, but that's a principle. We find them also not only in Vichy's government, we find them also in the collaborationist parties, much more extreme parties than the Vichy regime, the parties which we'll call the parties in Paris, which are really pro-Nazi parties. We find a lot at the head of those parties of former Philo-Semites, of active Philo-Semites. I mean, in order to be characterized as a Philo-Semite in my research, you have to have published an article, to have signed a petition, you have to be a member of a pro-Jewish organization or an anti-racist organization. It's not only a passive kind of philo-Semitism, but an active kind of philo-Semitism. So the phenomenon is a mass phenomenon. I found it also in Belgium. Also, I hadn't made such a detailed research concerning Belgium. I would have done that in the case of the Netherlands, but you know that in order to enter the Netherlands, you need a written permission by Manfred Gessen. I hadn't asked him for such a permission. So. What happened? And what is the reason which brought so many philo-Semites to change their mind and to become, in a way or in another, collaborators with a policy or collaborators with the Nazi, meaning the persecution of the Jews and then the extermination of the Jews. Before 1933, if you take the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, there is a very close correlation. There is even a sort of symbiosis between pacifism and philo-Semitism. The sectors where the Jewish organizations are, Jewish organizations are always recruiting for non-Jews coming to the assemblies or signing articles saying that the Jews are good and anti-Semitism is bad. You know that. It's exactly what we do today, we did in the 20s and in the 30s, exactly. I may say with the same efficiency, but I won't enter the question of efficiency. It's clear the question is clear to all of us. The sector in which it was easier to recruit non-Jews ready to speak against anti-Semitism was naturally the humanitarian sector and the pacifist sector. The same indignation that you feel against the war and the atrocities of war, you feel against the pogroms in Poland or pogroms in Romania, and the same feeling that war must be stopped brought you also to the conclusion that anti-Semitism must be stopped. And so, when the Jews were recruiting friends by the non-Jews, this was the main sector of recruitment. Automatically, you understand it's clear, and if you take, for instance, the organizations, the anti-Semitic organizations which were active in the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, of course, the pacifists were dominating these organizations. And then came 1933, the victory of Hitler in Germany, and this brought the pacifist and the humanitarian in Western Europe to a dilemma, to a dramatic and tragical dilemma. Because they were ready to protest against anti-Semitism anywhere in the world. They had a problem to condemn anti-Semitism in Germany. And why? Because Germany was a country we had to make peace with. And Germany was a country, they were against any incitement, any hostile propaganda, and so they immediately saw that protesting against anti-Semitism in Germany was a way of preparing war against Germany. And this is the dilemma of 1933, of the pacifist movement of 1933. Some of them will say, what is happening in Germany is horrible, so we condemn Nazi Germany. Others will say, we are not ready to condemn Germany, because war, if there is a new war in Europe, the consequences could be terrible and horrible. And there are a lot of examples. I'll give only one illustration of that dilemma. When the Jewish organizations start to protest, and there is a mass protest against, especially in February, March, April 1933, with huge demonstration, for the pacifists there is a problem. Even for the pacifists who beforehand were Philo-Semites, were pro-Jewish, now they have a problem, and they are quite reluctant to participate to the demonstrations, because the demonstrations are considered to be anti-German demonstrations, and they don't want any anti-German demonstration, because they want peace with Germany, and peace with Germany is essential for the future of Europe. I'll give only one quotation. A very important intellectual leaves in 1933 the French organizations for fighting anti-Semitism, and he explains in an article, a very well-written article, he said, I'm a friend of the Jews and I will always be on the side of the Jews, but if I have to choose between the fate of 600,000 Jews in Germany, who are persecuted, I admit, and a war in Europe, a new war in Europe between France and Germany with millions of soldiers who could be dead, who would be killed during that war, I choose peace and not my friendship to the Jews. And so he says to the Jews, I'm sorry, but I leave you. That's very interesting because the article is written with compassion. The article, the man who writes the articles knows what is happening to the Jews in Germany in 1933, the beginning of the persecution of the Jews in Germany, but deliberately he says, I prefer peace. If I have to choose between peace between France and Germany and the fate of the Jews, I choose peace. We see that during the campaign, the anti-German campaign of spring of 1933, the huge demonstrations organized by Jewish organizations everywhere in the world. We see that during the launching of the boycott movement of Nazi Germany, some of you maybe know that it was one of the Jewish initiatives for fighting Nazi Germany was to launch a huge boycott movement against the imports of Nazi Germany. For that you need also public opinion, for that you need also the former friends of the Jews, and here you see those friends are not ready to participate, because they say it's hostility against Germany, we cannot accept the principle of hostility against Germany because we have to make peace with Germany. Nazi propaganda knows that and will use that all along the 1930s. The Nazi propaganda takes into account the fact that in Western Europe you have broad sector pacifists, different kind of pacifists, of course. There are different kind of, I will not enter the different categories and different sorts of pacifists. But for Nazi Germany, it is part of what has to be said and what has to be presented to Western opinion. I'll give only one example. The counter-campaign, the German counter-campaign to the Jewish campaign of protest of March, April 1933. You know that the Germans reply by two ways. The first way is to punish the German Jews by organizing the boycott of the German shops, of the Jewish shops and trade in Germany on the 1st of April. That's replying by punishing the German Jews. But the second reply is much more important, of course. It's a reply by a counter-campaign of explanation. And the German counter-campaign of explanation is very well elaborated and very well implemented. I'm speaking of the first months of the Nazi regime, explaining first there was some exaggeration in the report, but the main argument was Germany is the victim of a campaign of demonization. Germany is the victim, New Germany is the victim of a campaign of vilification. We are the victims of vilification, a campaign of vilification. We are the victims of a campaign of Gräuel propaganda. And Gräuel propaganda means atrocity propaganda. It refers to the First World War, where horrible stories were invented against the Germans or against the others. And the Nazis said it's the same kind of propaganda. It appears to be a false propaganda, so they say in 1933, as during the First World War there were horrible stories that Germans were cutting the hands of Belgian children and so on. A lot of stories of the kind which appear to be untrue, completely untrue. They were pure propaganda. And so the Germans say what they are saying now about Nazi Germany in 1933 is also Gräuel propaganda, is also atrocity propaganda. It works. This argument works. If you study the way the argument infiltrates the Western press and the Western sectors of public opinion, it works. And you'll find a lot of articles, a lot of editorials saying maybe they are right, maybe it's like the propaganda during the war. We have to be cautious now using such propaganda and so on. More than that, and much more than that. The Nazi propaganda uses during the 30s the basic and the fundamental elements which constitute the pacifist ideology and the humanitarian ideology. And they do that with a skill, with a mastership, which is one of the greatest victories of Hitler as a tactician, of course, is the way they are conquering Western opinion during the 30s. First, the idea that Germany is a victim, the victimization of Germany. It's a classical, it appears everywhere. The Nazi propaganda is a propaganda of victimization. Internal too, the internal propaganda also is a propaganda of victimization. We were victims and now we are getting free. But concerning the external world, saying that Germany has suffered a lot during the 20s, so Germany is victim of a treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, which is an unfair treaty. It's an unfair treaty, essentially, explains Hitler and the others, that every nation in Europe has the right of having an army, and we are the only one who are limited in our possibility of having an army. And so the victimization, we are different of the others, we are persecuted, and we have not the same right as the others. And our demand is a simple demand, so will say Hitler, of having the same right as the others. And this will be the major theme of Nazi propaganda in 34, 35, 36. Those years are critical years, because Germany is still very weak. The French are still much stronger than the Germans. The equilibrium will come, the balance will come at about 36, 37. But the first years of the Nazi regimes, Germany is very weak, and so for them it's very important to present such an image in Europe. So that's the first idea. We are victims, and it works, because for the humanitarians, the idea of unfairness, the idea of a nation suffering from persecution or suffering from discrimination, for the humanitarians, it works. It works because it is exactly adapted to the main preoccupation of the humanitarian world. Second idea, of course, which is very important for the pacifist movement in Europe, in the United States too. Germany wants peace. The only thing we want is peace, and you know that Hitler will sign a peace treaty with Poland in 1934. He will declare that he renounces to any territorial conflict with the French, and the main idea which will be propagated outside is that Nazism is for Germany. It's not a product for outside and so it will work. The idea that in fact Hitler wants peace. If you read Hitler's speeches during the 30s, and especially during 34, 35, 4, 5, 6, they are wonderful peace speeches, and it works. And it gives the necessary time to the German industry to organize the military build-up and the new army and the build-up of German power, German military power. Another principle, which is accessible and which is important for the humanitarian sectors, is the principle of self-determination. Self-determination of various populations is a basic principle of the humanitarian ideology. And Hitler will use the principle of self-determination. He will use that for the Saarland in 1935, the referendum on the Saarland, which will be given back to Germany. He will use that in 1936 with the reoccupation by the German army, the remilitarization of the west bank of the Rhine. And of course, he will use that magnificently and perfectly concerning the Sudeten in 1938 in Czechoslovakia and Sweden. The principle of self-determination works because it corresponds directly to one of the basic principles of the humanitarian people. Now I come back to the Jewish organization. The Jewish organization understand what is happening. And you see a lot of confrontations between those Jewish organizations and their former friends, because their former friends are leaving them. The way they live may be different from one person to another. It may be even different from one country to another. But basically, the Jewish organizations are aware of the phenomenon of being left away by their former friends. That new anti-Semitism. Not all of them who leave them will be anti-Semite. There will be a lot of cases, and I registered a lot of examples in Belgium too, of people who will say, I understand the Nazis, I agree that the Nazis don't want war, that the Nazis are in favor of peace. There is only one matter about which I disagree with the Nazis, it's a Jewish question. For instance, one of the French pacifists makes a journey in Germany in 1938. He comes back with a wonderful article saying that I'm now convinced that Germany wants peace. I'm completely convinced. All the people I spoke to told me that Germany wants peace. It's clear that Germany wants peace. There is only one question which I don't agree with which bothered me when I was in Germany. It was the Jewish question. So some of them remain, they maintain a sort of compassion for the Jews. Although they are on the way of becoming Nazis, pro-Nazis, first pro-Nazis and afterwards completely Nazis, but they maintain a certain compassion for the Jews. Some of them are completely neutral and completely indifferent to the Jewish question. They don't speak about it. They are pro-Nazis. They accept the quasi-totality of the Nazi claims, as I said, equality of rights, self-determination for the Germans, and so on, but they don't speak about the Jews. And some of them become anti-Semites. And this is very interesting to look at this category of those who gradually, each of them according to his own itinerary, but globally it's a collective move from philo-Semitism to anti-Semitism. And we see some classical phases in that evolution. In the beginning, they say, okay, we want peace with Germany, and we understand that Germany has suffered a lot. How comes, they ask, and they ask sincerely. In the beginning, they are sincere. How comes that such a country like Germany becomes anti-Semite? How comes that they are persecuting the Jews? They must have good reason for that. Because per definition, the Germans are good, everyone is good, the Germans want peace. So if they are persecuting the Jews, they must have reasons. So they say, let's look at the reasons. And you see those former philo-Semites starting to analyze the reasons, or the so-called reasons. And you see some articles appearing explaining that it is true that during the 20s, the Jews have occupied in Germany a too important place in the economy. It is true. So they accept partially, you understand, first they accept partially the anti-Semitic argumentation, not totally. They are not racists, for instance, but they accept that there was too much Jewish influence. Secondly, they accept also the idea that the Jews are acting for war, that the Jews in Europe, especially the French Jews or the British Jews, are preparing war against Germany in order to help their brothers, the German Jews, who are persecuted. And for the pacifists, more and more, it starts in 1933, but it's very clear in 1938, the Jews are preparing war, the Jews are propagating the idea that we have to make war against Germany. And for a pacifist, the idea that the group is advocating war against Germany, for a pacifist, it's too much, it's unacceptable. And so you see, especially in 1938, a lot of articles saying, I was a friend of the Jews. It always starts with, I was a friend of the Jews and I have no lessons to receive from anyone. You know that rhetoric we heard. You have no lessons to receive and I'll always be on the side of the Jews. But the Jews are exaggerating, saying they are demanding for a war against Germany. The Jews are warmongering. The idea that the Jews are warmongering, it's not only a Nazi idea, it will be used, of course, by the Nazis, used and abused by the Nazis all along the pre-war and the war itself. It's also an argument which succeeds, which have a lot of appeal for the pacifists. Because the pacifists are afraid of the idea that there will be a new war in Europe, and they are convinced more and more that the Jews are working for that, are demanding that war, and so for that category, as I said, it was not all of them, but for that category, anti-Semitism becomes part of their Weltanschauung, part of their ideological conception, and because they came to the conclusions, I'm sorry to say that, but the Jews are wanting war. It's difficult for me to say that, they say, considering my past and considering my former activities. They always refer to the past, but I have to admit, or we have to admit, that the Jews are preparing war, and this is unacceptable, we cannot accept it. So, more or less, this category becomes anti-Semites. Some of them will become very anti-Semite of a very high level of hostility to the Jews. Some of them will remain anti-Semite, moderate or half-moderate anti-Semite. Here you have a variety of itineraries and of possibilities and of directions. Do I have a few minutes more?
Sure.
And so, this explains the number of Semites becoming anti-Semites, and the number of humanitarians becoming Nazis. In order to understand the totality of what happened in 1933, remember that I mentioned that 1933, the victory of Nazism, presented a dramatic dilemma for the pacifists. A dilemma. They had to choose between Philo-Semitism and peace. But 1933 presented also a dramatic dilemma for the extreme rightist anti-Semites. And what was the dilemma for the anti-Semites and for the extreme rightists in Europe, in France, but not only in France? As I said, they had the same dilemma. On one side, what is happening in Germany in 1933 is very good. Here you have a central country in Europe which succeeded in eliminating parliamentarism, eliminating the communists, and eliminating the Jew and Jewish influence. So that's wonderful. In the middle of Europe, a strong country in the middle of Europe, succeeding to do what we would have liked to do in our country, and we are not able to do that because we are too weak, we are too little, we are little parties, and so on. And here you have all our hopes being realized in Germany. But on the second hand, and that's the dilemma of the extreme right, everyone understands in the extreme right, the European extreme right, it's true for Belgium, it's true for the British also, and Masley is very reluctant in the beginning concerning the Nazis, and of course for the French. Everyone understands that Nazism means a reinforcement of Germany, and that a reinforcement of Germany means, for their own country, means a potential danger. And the French extreme right understands that on one side Germany, Nazism is good, it's against the Jew, the communist. On the second hand, it may be bad for France, because Nazism means a reinforcement, means a new Germany, and a new Germany, even in the short term, may become dangerous for France. And this is the same dilemma. It's a symmetric dilemma. Some of them will say the positive aspects of Nazism are dominating, and so I go with Nazism, because they are the only one who succeed in eliminating the Jews and the communists and so on. So I will remain faithful, I will be close to them, and during the war I will remain faithful to them. I'm thinking of De Grey, for instance, in Belgium. For him it's clear. It's clear. He said they are those who brought light in Europe, and so I go with them, even if it's not my country, even if it's another country, and even if they are dominating my own country. But for the others, in the extreme right, Nazism means danger. And this will bring a lot of anti-Semites to resistance and not to collaboration. Because for them, patriotism will prevail over ideology, and they will say, Nazism is good for Germany, but it may be bad for France. And if it's bad for France, I have to be anti-Nazi, and if the Germans conquer France, I have to fight against them. And this explains this movement, this cross movement, this paradoxical movement, who will bring a lot of former Philo-Semites to collaboration with the Nazi, by a logical way. As you understand, it's a logical way, it's not an aberration. It's logical, and this will bring a lot of anti-Semites to resistance and not to collaboration. Of course, and we don't have to forget that, there will be a lot of leftists in the resistance too, including a lot of pacifists which will be resistant, and even leaders of the resistance, and there will be a lot of extreme rightists who will be pro-Nazi and collaborators and anti-Jewish and participating directly to the persecution of the Jews. But we don't have only those two tracks, which are the direct tracks, we have also those paradoxal tracks. Philo-Semites becoming anti-Semites and collaborationists, and anti-Semites becoming resistance and fighting the Nazis. As a conclusion, I would like to say a few words about what is happening today. Yes? When we look at the humanitarian organizations, the West European humanitarian organizations, we see some of the characteristics of what I said about the 30s. The incapacity of understanding what is on the other side, the incapacity of understanding who is the real aggressor, the aptitude to accept any hostile propaganda on the conditions that that propaganda should be based on the principles of anti-discrimination, or principle of equality of rights, and so on. It's an incapacity which was already shown and demonstrated concerning the 30s, and which we see today, where they are looking at, for instance, the activist Islamic forces in the world, for instance. And it's an incapacity of looking at reality. Of course, the circumstances are different. The intensity is different. Basically, you see the same incapacity and the same the propension to accept, or some tendency to accept the arguments on the condition that the arguments are presented on the basis of non-discrimination and so on. I'd like just two ending, one ending remark, which is two ending remarks, which I'd like to mention. I have spoken about the humanitarian sectors. I haven't spoken about the Trotskyist sector. The Trotskyists are, from time to time, use humanitarian arguments, but their basic ideology is not humanitarian, of course, it's revolutionary ideology. The Trotskyists are, in the countries we are dealing with today, are representing the force. They are the extreme leftist force, and they are representing the force after the fall of communism and the disparition of the communist parties in the countries where there were a strong communist party, like Italy or in France. And so Trotskyism represents today an important part of the extreme left, and of the extreme left which is hostile, of course, to the state of Israel. I'd like to mention only one thing which is very important. I don't know if we are all aware of it, and according to me it's very important. The Trotskyist movement have a basic and fundamental problem with the Shoah. Although a lot of them are Jews, they have a basic and fundamental problem with the Shoah. And the problem is the following one. You know that during the Second World War, the Trotskyist movement maintained a position of neutrality between the two camps. These are bad and these are bad. And some of them were arrested because they were Jews, arrested and killed because they were Jews. A minority of the Trotskyists in the occupied countries went to the resistance. The majority of the Trotskyist movement in the occupied countries maintained this position of neutrality. Neutrality meaning this is bad and this is bad. And their problem is the following one. The Shoah and Auschwitz prevent them to say that this is equivalent to that. The principle of equivalence between the two camps cannot be normally presented if you introduce the Shoah, because the Shoah means that it was not exactly equivalent. You may not say that Hitler was like Roosevelt, like they said during the war, and Hitler is like Roosevelt. It's absurd. And so one of the consequences concerning the Trotskyists was a deliberate, and there was some publication about that, I made some research about that, a deliberate occultation of the Shoah. Because the Shoah is again the principle of equivalence during the Second World War. In the collective memory of the Trotskyist movement, and this is completely different from the collective memory of the communist movement. The communist movement, on the contrary, hails the war against the fascists and so on. For the Trotskyists, the remembrance of the Shoah is a problem. So it has been eliminated. It has been eliminated during tens of years. If you look at the publications of the Trotskyist movement concerning the Second World War, the Shoah is not mentioned. One of the consequences will be that some negationist movements, minority, but some negationist movement will come from the extreme left and not from the extreme right. The majority will come from the extreme right, of course, but you have a minority of the Holocaust deniers who come from the extreme left. And secondly, this is one of the explanations why the extreme left and the Trotskyist movement today is so happy to establish a comparison between the Israelis and the Nazis. It's also a way, the first way of dealing with the problem of the Shoah was occultation, not to speak about it. The second way of dealing with that is simply the equivalence between the Israeli and the Nazis. And this is one of the paradoxes, and I will finish about that question. A lot of questions too, which could be mentioned, but I would like to a few words more about that question. This is a fantastic paradox. When it was a question of the real Nazis, the Trotskyists had propagated the idea that they are not worse than the others, the real Nazis, and that Hitler is equivalent to Roosevelt, more or less. That was the basic theme of Trotskyist propaganda during the war and after the war. But now that we are speaking of the Israelis, they are like Nazis. Suddenly the Nazis re-emerge from oblivion, they re-emerge from occultation, because the Nazis are used in order to make the equivalent between the Israelis and the Nazis. They were supposed to be equivalent to Roosevelt, so not to be so terrible. Today they are supposed to be terrible because they are equivalent to the Israelis. A last sentence. There is a glimpse. I may have.
Sure.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid of Manfred.
Manfred,
he says he's from Netherlands. In fact, he's a Yek. And he's a false Netherlands. There are some glimpses of hope, and I had a few months ago I had a meeting in France with some representative of the Ligue des droits de l'homme in Paris, League for Human Rights in Paris, and you have still in the humanitarian sector, you have still persons and people who are able to hear and who are able to understand that that Israel was demonized during the last years, who are able to understand that there is a real danger of anti-Semitism. So I would say, just in one sentence, it is not completely lost. It is not, the sector is not completely lost, and there are some fanatics in the sector, of course, and there are, including some Jewish fanatics in the sector, but there are also large sectors in the sector which are open to another view and to a more positive view concerning Israel and the Jews. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Dr. David Lazar, Edward Cohen, Avner Falk, Dr. Daphne Bergman. Let's start with, okay. Sorry. Yes. Have you 5 questions so far? We can take four more. Okay, as usually we take them three by three. So the first round, Dr. David Lazar, Edward Cohen, Dr. Avner Falk. David?
Yes, thank you for your lecture. You have not mentioned really any names. Were the people who were heading these, or at least spokespeople for those movements, notorious publicly? Were they just semi-intellectuals, journalists, and kind of self-educated haters or lovers? Or were they people that we know of in the political history of France in those years?
Second question, Edward.
Thank you. Not all anti-Zionists are anti-Semites, but I think that most are. In your really last remark, you mentioned something about fanatic Jews. And in this round, we see a lot of anti-Zionist Jews who may or may not be anti-Semitic, but they're certainly propagating anti-Semitism. Was there any similar parallel phenomenon in the 30s?
And final, Avner, in this
Thank you very much, Simcha, or should I say Simon? I don't know which you prefer. But your lecture was brilliant, as other things I've heard from you. Thank you very much. I have, because David Lazar, my friend, mentioned names, I would like to also mention names. One has to do with the First World War, which is outside the scope of time of your lecture, but still I think you probably know the answer. It has to do with people, the pacifist Romain Rolland and Frans Mazerel, who was a famous Belgian artist of woodcuts, and he was together with Romain Rolland in a group of pacifists called Au-dessus de la mêlée, above the battle, or whatever you call it. It's very hard to translate from French to English. But these were pacifists, and I wonder how much of they were anti-Semites or Philo-Semites, or they had no opposition on the Jews and so on. The second question has to do with the Second World War, with Auffoul's father and son. As you know, both were, Max Auffoul and Marcel were both directors, film directors. Max, if I remember correctly, was German, and his son was French. And his son, Marcel, made Le Chagrin et la Pitié, the film, which, The Sorrow and the Pity, which is a very important, in my view, very important film about what happened in the collaboration during the war and the French collaboration. And one of the most interesting things in this film was that he could interview people from many different sides, including Jews, Nazis, Frenchmen, collaborators, resistance, and so on. And as you know, of course, the film was not shown in France on the television, not even state television or private television, only in So very few, as far as I know, very few cinematheques in such places. And I wonder what the reaction of the French was to the to this film, which I think in many ways gives a very interesting picture of what happened in the collaboration and resistance, both during the war, and also the fact that the French Jews there were more French Jews that were saved during the war than in any other country in Europe, and what this has to do with the subject of your lecture. Thank you very much.
David, the names, the people I'm talking about are the top of collaboration. Some of them are ministers in the Vichy regime. Concerning the political parties, you will find Jacques Doriot, the head of one of the most important collaboration party. You will you'll find also Marcel Déat with the second leader of the second collaborationist parties, and you will find a lot of people around. So it's a central phenomenon. It's not a marginal phenomenon. I can give you, if you want, the list of the people, but answering your question, it's a central phenomenon, not a phenomenon in the proportion, not a marginal. Jewish anti-Zionists in the 30s. In the 30s, as we know, Jewish anti-Zionism comes from political parties, and strong political parties like the Bund in Poland, or like the Communist Party, or like also the Agudat Israel, which is a different kind of anti-Zionism. So in those days, the battle around Zionism is a political battle in the Jewish communities between different parties and different forces. The main question in the 30s is not a question of Zionism or anti-Zionism, but are there some Jews who accept this tendency of being pro-Nazi? There are. Not so many as we can find today, but you will find in the 30s some Jews who accept basically the idea that other Jews are asking for war, and they protest against that tendency. And of course the anti-Semite use them in order to say, even he says that his brother Jews are demanding war. So that may be an answer. It's not about Zionism or anti-Zionism, it's about the critical question of anti-Semitism and pacifism. Yeah, there are some. Avner. Romain Rolland, for your first question, Romain Rolland, you are right to mention him. He will be, after a few periods where he was quite ambiguous concerning the Jews, in the 30s he will be pro-Jewish, and during the war he will remain pro-Jewish. The Second World War he will remain pro-Jewish. So there is nothing to say about him. His followers, some of them will remain pro-Jewish, and will remain even in the resistance. Some of them will become anti-Semites. Some of his followers, and there are two of them, I forgot the name now, but there are two of his followers, the second level followers, who will become anti-Semite. That's about Romain Rolland. What you said about the film Le Chagrin et la Pitié is very important, because in the film was based on the idea, which was a dominating idea for tens of years, that the French right of the 30s went to collaboration, and the French left of the 30s went to resistance. And that there were two parallel tracks bringing from the left to resistance and from the right to collaboration. What I mentioned was something much more complicated. There was a parallel right, and there were also the paradoxical directions, bringing the left to collaboration and the extreme right to resistance. So, under that aspect, the film was marked by simplicity in perception.
Why was it banned in France? It was almost.
No, it was banned for other reasons. It was banned for the reason that it was considered. First, the radio and the television were not completely free in those days. They were still under governmental control, and people thought that it would be a prejudice to national unity and to the perception of war. It will give birth to a debate which could be. Today it seems absurd to have banned it for a few years, of course. About your last questions, why were so many Jews saved in France? You know that France is one of the countries where the percentage of survivors is the higher, because only 25% of the Jews in France were exterminated. So we have a percentage of 75% of survival, which is very high in the scala of extermination versus survival. Just in one sentence, because it's not our subject, although it's a very important subject. You cannot explain that without bringing into account the fact that there was a regime which was half autonomous, half independent, and that the regime was not ready to give the French Jews. They were only ready to give the they were not ready to give the French Jews, the Jews of French nationality. They were ready to give only the Jews of Polish citizenship and so on. Like in Bulgaria, but really it's not in our subject. Just in one sentence. If you take the map of survival in Europe, you will find that the countries where there were the highest rate of survival are the countries which had a regime pro-Nazi, but an independent regime. In the countries which were directly administrated by Germany, like Poland or you have the highest rate of extermination. Bulgaria will save its Jews, almost completely. Hungary will maintain her Jews till 1944. Romania will destroy its own Jews in the periphery provinces like Bessarabia and Bukovina, but will maintain its Jews of the internal provinces and so on. So France entered that pattern. It's part of that pattern.
Second round, we have Dr. Daphne Bertman, Victor Geller, Professor Leslie Wagner.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent enlightenment of your lecture. Coming to the current situation, as I understand it, Edward Said was the father of the idea of the victimization of the Palestinians. I wonder if you agree about that. He was a professor at Columbia University, and as such, according to Martin Kramer, also influenced the whole course of Middle Eastern studies in the United States, so they're relatively, or very preponderantly, pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian. And if you believe, in fact, that Edward Said was the father of the victimization idea, do you believe that it came de novo to him, or was it derived from the Nazi influence which propagated the Middle East after the Second World War? And I'd just like to mention that President Obama was a student of Edward Said's for 2 years at Columbia University. Thank you.
Victor?
In talking about the anti-Semitism of Europe and the effective German propaganda, you did not discuss the situation in America at that time, where anti-Semitism was dressed up in America first, Henry Ford, Ku Klux Klan, marches of Germans in Yorkville, in New York City, and where the 1936 American Olympic team that came to Germany eliminated Jewish racers and, of course, embarrassed the Germans with the black winner. What was the propaganda relationship, if any, between the Germans and these various anti-Jewish programs in America?
Could I add my thanks for a very interesting, enlightening lecture. One can understand what happened when the pacifists had to choose between the Jews and their misguided view about pacifism. But could I ask you about another layer, probably more important, which is the communists? Not the Trotskyists during the war and after the war, but the communists who were probably at their most influential in affecting Western thought, certainly Western liberal and left thought in the 30s, and were certainly influencing intellectuals in Britain, and I'm sure we're doing the same in France, and maybe even the trade unions. And they had a much more complex ideology to deal with about fighting, at least until the Soviet-Nazi pact later on, fighting the right, but at the same time denying the Jews any rights as a nation. So I just wonder, without going too long, where were the communists in all this in the 30s?
Okay.
About victimization of the Palestinians. I don't know if he was the first one. He certainly gave to that the basic and basic argumentation. But the problem of victimization of the Palestinians is much broader, of course. First, you have the victimization of the Third World, generally, for a country which was a colonial power. For Great Britain or for France, who had huge huge colonial empires. Of course, they are now full of a feeling of guilt concerning those populations, and it plays, of course, in favor of the Palestinians. It's part of the general context, of course, plus a specific victimization of the Palestinians. Whether it is linked or not to former patterns of victimization, I don't know, but it may be. It may be a direction of research, or a direction of thought, certainly. The United States. Who asked a question about the? Oh, sorry. Yes, Victor. The United States. You mentioned the KKK and the Henry Ford. But there was something much more important, which was the German Bund in the United States in the 30s, and the German Bund has one strategic purpose: to maintain the United States out of a European war, which would be good, of course, for Germany. So that was their strategic aim. For that, they used a propaganda, and there were a lot of research about the German Bund, a propaganda which was a quite moderate propaganda, explaining that the interest of the United States is neutrality, explaining the interest of peace for the world and for the United States, and so on. And you are right also to mention that there was a problem of pacifist, a very strong pacifist movement, pacifist and isolationist movement in the United States in the 30s, and which played, of course, in favor of Nazi Germany. Played in favor of Nazi Germany because Nazi Germany had a need of 3 or 4 years of calm in order to rearm and to become a great power again, to have new allies like Italy or Hungary and so on. And for those years it was a critical period. It was a critical period, and of course such an attitude by the United States helped them, of course. Although the central and critical point was France, of course, because France was the only country which was ready and which had the possibility of intervening in Nazi Germany during those critical years. And the question about the communists. This is very interesting and very important. At the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, the communists in France, in Germany, have a very sectarian attitude concerning the alliance with the socialists, for instance. You know, for instance, the way the KPD, the Communist Party in Germany, acts during the period of the seizure of power by Hitler. They act alone, they don't want to have any alliance with the socialists, and so on. It has also an influence on the attitudes concerning the Jews. And you know that there were some research about the Communist Party in Germany and the Jewish questions at the end of the 20s, the beginning of the 30s. They are quite ambiguous concerning the Jews, because they understand that anti-Semitism is a growing force in Germany, and they don't want to be against that force. We have the the famous sentence of Ruth Fischer. Ruth Fischer, she was a Jew. She was one of the leading personalities of the KPD, of the German Communist Party, and she has a sentence which will remain linked to her name. And she says, "They say that the Nazis are anti-Semite. Please show me the first Jews you have hanged." It was a way of saying it's not a real anti-Semitism. And there is also a publication of a book in Germany in 1930 by Otto Heller. Otto Heller was a Jew, and he published a book which advocated, in fact, the disparition of the Jewish people, the end of the... This will change in 1933, 1934. You know that there will be, after what was called the German catastrophe, meaning the rise in power of Hitler and the disparition of the German Communist Party, the Comintern, the International Communist in Moscow, will change dramatically its strategy for a new period from 34, 35 till 39, till this will be, in the history of the Communist parties, a period which is considered to be an anti-Nazi period. And the Soviet Union as a Communist Party will be the more active in fighting the Nazis in the various countries. First, fighting the Nazis. Secondly, for the first time, accepting the idea of alliance with the socialists and even with bourgeois parties in order to build what they called Popular Front. There was a Popular Front in France in 1936. There was a Popular Front in Spain before the insurrection by the generals. And concerning the Jews, if you take the period 35-39, the communist parties are those who fight against anti-Semitism. For the first time, it's a complete difference between that period and the former period. For instance, you will have films against anti-Semitism in Germany, which will be made in the Soviet Union and propagated by the Communist Party. One film, which is very famous, no one knows about him, Dr. Mamluk. It's a history of a Jew who is a doctor in Germany. He is persecuted. It's a Soviet film. He's persecuted. It's against, of course, the persecution of Dr. Mamluk. And the film is a Soviet film of the 30s and propagated in the world. Of course, it will change in 1939 with the signature of the pact in August 1939. Suddenly, they come back to the former attitude, meaning we are not fighting the Nazis. If there is a war between France and Great Britain on one side and Germany on the other side, it's an imperialistic war. We have nothing to do with such a war, and the Jews disappear. The Jews are no more a problem. The Nazis are no more anti-Semitic, and so on.
Last round, Yael, I believe. Avilera, Sarah Beza.
Yes, you mentioned that the European community upper echelons, so directors, do not get it, do not understand the rise of Islamo-Nazism or turn away from it, whereas the population is very much aware of it. And have you any idea, is it really that they're so unaware, or is that the modus operandi of Islamic conquests, that there's a lot of money being poured, Arab money being poured into their not knowing and turning their back on it?
Avi?
I want to ask something linked to what this woman said. Based on your lecture and the answers you've given to various questions and the parallels to today, is there an approach you can suggest that the Jewish world and the Israel government should take with regard to the opposition that we see?
Final question, Sarah.
This takes us up north again, where I come from. There on the through the email, there has been a discussion, it's still going on for about a year, about Jan Sibelius. There's a researcher in the state who wrote that he clearly thinks that Sibelius was an anti-Semite, and he brings a lot of proofs. he proves from his diaries and from the disappearance of 2 years, 42, 43, from Sibelius' own diaries. And first I thought, you know, he discussed with Finns, and I looked up who they were. They were the prime musicologists in Finland, all of them, and they have this argument going on through letters written to each other. Now, why do I ask you is because they said in the 30s it was all right to be pro-German. He had his money, his agent in Germany. That's why he worked with Germany. That was a way of making a living, because he had problems making a living. That's the first answer. The second one was, so you don't know the 30s. The 30s people were pro-German. So Tim asked them, the American professor, and the 40s. So say the 40s he had to make a living as well. And he did appear with not pro-Nazis, Nazis themselves. So why did he appear with Nazis? Because that was just, again, to survive, and that was usual in that times. So I wanted to ask you if these arguments, you can hear about other people as well. The argument also goes with experiments on racial experiments, and they also said this was done all over Europe in the 30s, and it's not something special for the Scandinavian countries.
Start with Sibelius. I have no idea about him. I have just an air in my head, more or less, but I won't, no, that's what I won't think. What is true is that it was, Nazi Germany was acceptable in the 30s. It is true, and there were a lot of reasons for people to be friends of Nazi Germany. Well, a lot of reasons, or so-called reasons. It is true also that Scandinavia in the 30s was completely closed to Jewish refugees. If you take the map of the world and the attempts of German Jews, Austrian Jews, Czechoslovakian Jews, and more broadly Polish Jews, Romanian Jews to leave their countries, you have some countries which were hermetically closed to Jewish immigration. And the Scandinavian countries were of those. They were not the only ones. Switzerland was also, but the Scandinavian countries were systematically closed to almost systematically closed to Jewish refugees and to Jewish immigration, which made it easier for Denmark to save the Jews, because there were not a lot of Jews in Denmark. That was the other side of the same reality. It was relatively easy to save the Jews because there were only a few thousand Jews in Denmark. Concerning Islam, and I don't think it's a question of money. I think it's something in the European liberal mentality, an incapacity to understanding what is happening on the other side. And I'll give just one illustration of that, which is very interesting. You know that in every country you have statistics about what is called in the United States hate crimes. Criminality on the basis of discrimination, or criminality on the basis of origin. You attack a Jew, you attack a Muslim, you attack someone on the basis of his... In all the countries, apart from one country, I will afterwards say, the statistics are asymmetric. If a Muslim is a victim of an attack, he is mentioned as a Muslim. If a Muslim is responsible for an attack, is guilty of an attack, he is not mentioned as a Muslim. The attacker is with no origin, with no ethnic belonging. It's a general attack. The only country which mentioned the ethnic origin of the attackers, of the Muslims, when they are attackers and not only victims, the only country, you will understand which country, it's of course Germany. Because for Germany it's very important to show that the attacker is a Muslim and not a German. So in the German official statistics, statistics of the Verfassungsschutz, you will find the ethnic origin of the attacker and not only the ethnic origin of the victim. just an illustration. It's an incapacity. It's an incapacity of accepting the fact that a Muslim who was, in their perception, it was half true, let us say, and half exaggerated, was discriminated in the past, or who was victim of the colonial policies, let us say, they cannot accept that he is also a perpetrator of crimes and a perpetrator of violence against the Jews. It's a problem of incapacity. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think it's a plot. I don't think it's a direct effect of money. Yes.
I think it is that they fear that will be like copycat effect if they mention it more. Then there will be more crimes. It's on that basis that they've stopped mentioning the ethnicity of the attackers.
No. I'm speaking of statistics which are generally not published, or statistics for specialists. Even in the statistics for specialists, statistics which are used by the police, or which every national police send to the other police in order to exchange material, exchange of material, you find it's a sort of lacuna. It's something which does not appear. Which is something apart from, as I said, from the journal. So, according to me, it's significant of this incapacity of you have to cross a line. You have to cross a certain line, and they are not ready to do that. They are not ready to do that. What should we do? And this is, of course, the classical question. And I'll give you a two-dimensional answer. First, ideologically, I had some discussions with Manfred about that. I belong to the classical Zionist ideological attitude, saying that we do not fight anti-Semitism, we build our country and we concentrate the Jews on our country. So there is no, this is a classical Zionist attitude concerning. Of course, it's very difficult to maintain such an attitude, and we understand that now. We understand that anti-Zionism in Western Europe or in the Western world represents a strategic threat to the state of Israel, and so we cannot be we cannot maintain ourselves out of the fight. And here we know that we have limits, and we are very limited in our ways of reacting, and it's very easy. I saw that because I already observed a few waves of anti-Semitism. I'm an old observer and commentator of anti-Semitism, so I observed the wave at the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s. There was another wave at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, and here we have the wave after 2000. So I've already seen the reactions. And at the beginning of a wave, there is always someone who comes and who say, never again. We shall fight, we shall do, we shall... And generally he receives all the congratulations of the public and of the audience, and everyone agrees that we should do, and we will show them, and we'll never accept, and so on. And then the years pass, and someone does something, and I have to admit and to say that what is done here in this house is important in terms of publications, in terms of materials. It's important. It is not the final. It is not the ultimate weapon. It is not the final. It's not the final victory. It's not final victory. We are in a world where we are a minority, and we have a lot of enemies coming from various directions, and so on. So I would not be so optimistic. I'm not sure there is a final way or an ultimate way of fighting. I'm not sure. But remember what I said. I mentioned, nevertheless, that there are some glimpses of hopes. I mentioned that with my talks I had with the direction of the Ligue des droits de l'homme in France, which are leftist, humanitarian, pro-Palestinian. When you explain them, when you speak, when you invest time, and when you bring material which is important, when you are ready to speak, you may have some results. You may have some results. So it's not completely lost. That's what I would say. But we are not. We are in a field. We are in a field where there are not victories. We have to know that. We have to know that it's not for victory. It's for for containing the enemy, it's for short-term victories or partial victories. There is no complete, in terms of anti-Semitism, there are no victories.
Thank you very much. This is a growing field, so there is a lot of potential for you to expand on that. You have today touched on one aspect, but I think that the issue of the 30s and today is an issue which will increase in importance in the coming years, and I hope you'll continue to make contributions. Thank you very much.